Long before the Maya built their towering pyramids, long before the Aztec ruled their island capital in the middle of a great lake, there was another civilization, one that came first. One that many archaeologists consider the true foundation, the mother culture, from which nearly every major civilization of ancient Mesoamerica would eventually grow. The Olmec carved massive stone heads weighing many tons, each with distinct individual facial features. They developed one of the earliest writing systems anywhere in the Americas. They created calendar systems that later cultures would build directly upon. And then, at several of their most important cities, something strange happened. Their monuments weren't simply abandoned to time and weather. They were deliberately, carefully defaced, in some cases dragged considerable distances, and buried, seemingly on purpose, by someone. And to this day, we genuinely don't know exactly who did it, or why. Today we're exploring the story of the Olmec, the true origins of Mesoamerican civilization, and the strange, still unsolved mystery of their monuments' deliberate destruction. Let's start by establishing exactly why the Olmec matter so much, because understanding their significance is essential to understanding just how genuinely important and how genuinely puzzling their story really is. The Olmec civilization developed in the tropical lowlands of what is now the Gulf Coast region of Mexico, primarily in the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, beginning as early as 1500 BCE and reaching its most sophisticated and influential period between roughly 1200 and 400 BCE. This means the Olmec were flourishing well over 1,000 years before the Maya civilization would reach its own classic period peak, and well over 2,000 years before the Aztec Empire would rise to dominance in central Mexico. Archaeologists and historians commonly refer to the Olmec as Mesoamerica's mother culture, a term that reflects genuine, extensive archaeological evidence suggesting that many of the defining cultural, religious, artistic, and political features that would later characterize the Maya, the Zapotec, the Aztec, and virtually every other major civilization across ancient Mexico and Central America can be traced back, at least in significant part, to innovations that first emerged among the Olmec. This includes early forms of the Mesoamerican ballgame, a ritually significant sport played across the region for thousands of years. Elements of the complex calendar systems that later cultures like the Maya would refine into extraordinarily sophisticated astronomical and ritual calendars, early writing and iconographic systems, and a shared religious and mythological framework, including the veneration of figures like a feathered serpent deity, that would echo throughout Mesoamerican religious traditions for the next 2,500 years, right up through the Aztec worship of the god Quetzalcoatl at the time of European contact. The most iconic and instantly recognizable achievement of Olmec civilization is, without question, the colossal stone heads, of which archaeologists have discovered 17 confirmed examples so far, primarily concentrated at two major Olmec centers, San Lorenzo and La Venta. These massive sculptures, carved from single enormous blocks of volcanic basalt stone, range in height from roughly 5 to 11 feet, and can weigh anywhere from 6 to 50 tons depending on the specific example. Each head is carved with distinct, individualized facial features, including specific expressions, distinctive headgear, believed to represent ballgame helmets or symbols of political and religious authority, and what many researchers interpret as portraits of specific, real historical Olmec rulers rather than generic, idealized representations and interpretation that, if correct, would make these among the earliest known individualized political portrait sculptures anywhere in the Americas. What makes these colossal heads especially remarkable from an engineering perspective is the fact that the volcanic basalt stone used to carve them didn't originate anywhere near the sites where the finished sculptures were ultimately placed. Geological analysis has traced the source material for many of these heads to specific volcanic mountain ranges located many miles away from the major Olmec centers, meaning that these multi-ton stone blocks had to be quarried and then transported overland and likely via river systems across considerable distances, using nothing but Stone Age technology, no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals suited to hauling heavy loads, before finally being carved with the remarkable precision and individualized artistic detail these sculptures display. An enormous undertaking of both engineering, logistics, and skilled artistic craftsmanship, executed by a civilization operating more than 3,000 years ago. beyond the colossal heads. The Olmec developed sophisticated urban centers featuring some of the earliest monumental architecture anywhere in Mesoamerica, including large earthen platform mounds and plazas at sites like San Lorenzo, which flourished as the dominant Olmec center roughly between 1200 and 900 BCE, and La Venta, which rose to prominence as the leading Olmec center in the centuries that followed, roughly between 900 and 400 BCE, featuring, among other structures, a massive earthen pyramid rising over 100 feet, one of the largest structures built anywhere in the Americas up to that point in history. The Olmec also left behind some of the earliest evidence of writing anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Archaeological discoveries, including an artifact known as the Cascajal block, a stone slab bearing a sequence of carved symbols discovered in the region historically associated with Olmec civilization, have led many researchers to conclude that the Olmec developed one of the earliest, and quite possibly the very earliest writing systems in the entire Americas, predating the writing systems of the later Maya and Zapotec civilizations, both of which are generally believed by scholars to have drawn upon and further developed earlier Olmec innovations in writing and symbolic communication. So we have, once again, a civilization of genuine, foundational historical importance, pioneering achievements in monumental art and architecture, early writing, sophisticated calendar and religious systems that would go on to shape virtually every subsequent Mesoamerican civilization for the next 2,000 years. And yet, despite this remarkable foundational legacy, the Olmec themselves remain even today considerably less well known to the general public than the later civilizations they so profoundly influenced, the Maya and the Aztec. A genuine gap in popular historical awareness that makes their story especially worth exploring in real depth. Now let's turn to the central mystery of this story, the strange, still genuinely unresolved question surrounding the deliberate destruction of Olmec monuments at several of their most important centers. This isn't simply a case of ancient monuments gradually eroding, weathering, or collapsing over centuries of natural decay, the kind of damage archaeologists routinely encounter and can readily explain through ordinary environmental processes. What archaeologists have discovered at sites like San Lorenzo, and to some extent at La Venta as well, is evidence of what appears to be deliberate, systematic, intentional destruction and defacement of major monuments, carried out by human hands, evidently on purpose, at San Lorenzo specifically. Archaeological excavations have revealed that a significant number of the massive stone monuments at the site, including several of the colossal heads themselves, along with other important carved stone sculptures, show clear evidence of deliberate mutilation. Facial features on several sculptures appear to have been intentionally chiseled away or damaged in ways that are difficult to explain through simple natural weathering or accidental damage. Even more strikingly, many of these damaged monuments were subsequently moved from their original locations, in some cases dragged considerable distances across the site, and then deliberately buried, arranged in what appear to be intentional, carefully organized rows within specially prepared trenches or pits. A pattern of behavior that strongly suggests organized, purposeful human activity, rather than random destruction or simple abandonment followed by gradual natural burial under accumulated soil and sediment over the centuries. This deliberate defacement and burial appears to be concentrated within a specific, relatively narrow window of time, generally associated by archaeologists with the period around 900 BCE, corresponding roughly with San Lorenzo's decline as the dominant Olmec center and the subsequent rise of La Venta as the new leading center of Olmec civilization. A similar, though somewhat less extensively documented, pattern of monument destruction and burial has also been identified at La Venta itself, generally associated with the later period, roughly corresponding with La Venta's own eventual decline around 400 BCE. The point at which Olmec civilization, as the dominant cultural force in the region, more broadly appears to have entered its own final period of decline. So who did this and why? This is where we genuinely enter the realm of active archaeological debate. Because the honest, direct answer is that we don't have a definitively proven, universally agreed upon explanation, though researchers have proposed several serious, evidence-based theories, each carrying different implications for how we should understand this remarkable, still mysterious behavior. The first major theory proposes that this destruction represents a form of ritual decommissioning or ritual killing of sacred objects, a practice that has genuine parallels in various cultures around the world. including elsewhere in ancient Mesoamerica in later periods where certain objects, buildings, or monuments considered to possess a kind of sacred life force or spiritual power were deliberately, ritually killed or decommissioned once they had served their intended purpose, or once the specific individual or dynasty they were associated with had died or lost power, through a formal process that could include deliberate damage or mutilation followed by ceremonial burial, treating the monument almost as though it were itself a living entity requiring a proper ritual death and burial, rather than simply being discarded or left to decay naturally. The second major theory proposes that this destruction reflects internal political conflict or dynastic change within Olmec society itself, essentially a form of damnatio memoriae, a term borrowed from later Roman historical practice, referring to the deliberate erasure of a specific individual's memory and legacy following their political downfall or death, often involving the destruction or defacement of monuments and portraits associated with that specific disgraced or deposed ruler. Under this interpretation, the deliberate mutilation of specific colossal heads, which many researchers believe represent portraits of specific individual Olmec rulers, could reflect a genuine political transition, potentially even a violent one, in which a new ruling faction or dynasty deliberately destroyed and buried the monuments associated with a previous ruler or ruling lineage they had displaced from power. A practice of erasing a predecessor's political legacy that has clear, well-documented parallels across numerous other ancient civilizations throughout world history. A third theory, somewhat related to the second, proposes that this destruction may reflect broader social or political upheaval associated with San Lorenzo's decline as the dominant Olmec center and La Venta's corresponding rise, potentially involving genuine conflict, whether internal rebellion or external conflict with rival communities, severe enough that the losing faction's most important sacred and political monuments were deliberately targeted for destruction and ritual, burial as a way of symbolically and permanently ending their political and religious authority, a kind of decisive, ritualized closing of one chapter of Olmec political history to make way symbolically, and perhaps also practically, for the next, a fourth. Somewhat more speculative theory proposes that environmental factors, including significant shifts in the course of local rivers, which archaeological and geological evidence suggests did occur in the region around San Lorenzo during this general period, potentially disrupting the agricultural productivity and trade access that had originally allowed San Lorenzo to flourish as the dominant Olmec center in the first place, may have contributed to a broader crisis of political legitimacy for San Lorenzo's ruling authorities, a crisis that then manifested, at least in part, through this pattern of deliberate monument destruction, whether as an expression of internal social unrest and rejection of leadership that had seemingly lost the favor of important natural or divine forces, or as part of the broader political transition toward La Venta, as environmental and economic circumstances shifted. What's genuinely fascinating, and genuinely frustrating for researchers, is that these various theories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and the honest, most scientifically responsible answer is likely that we're looking at a complex, still not fully understood, combination of ritual religious practice, genuine internal political upheaval, and possibly environmental pressures, all potentially intertwined and reinforcing one another, playing out across these final, tumultuous centuries of Olmec civilization at both San Lorenzo and later at La Venta. Without deciphered written Olmec texts directly explaining these events in their own words and from their own perspective, which simply don't exist for us to draw upon in the way, for instance, that later Maya inscriptions can sometimes directly document specific historical political events and transitions. We're left interpreting this genuinely striking archaeological evidence largely through careful comparison with practices documented in other, better understood ancient cultures, and through painstaking analysis of the precise physical patterns of damage, movement, and burial found at these Olmec sites themselves. By around 400 BCE, Olmec civilization, as the dominant cultural and political force across the Gulf Coast region, had entered its final period of significant decline, with La Venta itself eventually being abandoned as a major population and political center. It's important to note, much as we've emphasized with several other civilizations in this series, that this decline did not represent some kind of total civilizational extinction or complete cultural disappearance. Rather, Olmec cultural influence, religious traditions, artistic conventions, and foundational innovations in writing, calendar systems, and monumental architecture continued forward, carried onward, and further developed by the various Mesoamerican civilizations that followed in the Olmec's wake, most notably the Maya, whose own classic period civilization would begin its own remarkable rise in the centuries following the Olmec's decline, building directly upon this earlier Olmec cultural and technological foundation in ways that archaeologists and art historians can trace with real, substantial confidence, in many genuine ways. Then, the Olmec never truly vanished at all. Not in the way that popular imagination sometimes frames these kinds of ancient mysteries. Their specific political centers at San Lorenzo and La Venta did decline and were eventually abandoned. Their particular ruling dynasties and political structures did come to an end, but their deeper cultural legacy, their artistic innovations, their religious concepts, their early writing systems, their sophisticated calendar knowledge, was carried forward and built upon by every major subsequent Mesoamerican civilization for the next 2,000 years. Right up through the Aztec Empire that Spanish conquistadors would eventually encounter in the 16th century. An empire whose own religious practices, calendar systems, and artistic traditions still carried. Whether the Aztec themselves fully recognized it or not, the deep, foundational imprint of this much earlier civilization that had first taken root along the Gulf Coast of Mexico over 3,000 years earlier. What makes the Olmec story so genuinely compelling, and honestly so deserving of far more popular attention than it currently receives compared to the Maya and Aztec civilizations that came later and built so directly upon Olmec foundations, is this combination of extraordinary, genuinely foundational cultural achievement. Remarkable engineering and artistic sophistication achieved thousands of years before comparable technology existed elsewhere in the region, and this striking, still not fully solved mystery surrounding the deliberate, intentional destruction and burial of their most important monuments. Evidence of real human drama, real political upheaval, and quite possibly deeply held religious conviction, played out among a civilization whose own voice, whose own explanation for these remarkable events, remains locked away in rating systems and historical records we still cannot fully recover or translate, leaving us to reconstruct their story piece by careful piece, monument by deliberately buried monument, from a civilization that, despite giving birth to so much of what would follow across ancient Mesoamerica for the next 2 millennia, remains even now one of history's most significant and most genuinely underexplored mysteries.